Waiting for the thing to yell at me that it's recording. Okay. Welcome, folks. Thanks for joining us today on this afternoon. My name is Peter Casarella. I'm the Executive Director of the SouthGrow Regional Initiative. And this Lunch and Learn is on international trade. And today we have with us Carlo Dade from the Canada West Foundation. He's the Director of Trade and Trade Infrastructure for the Foundation. And he's one of the country's leading voices on defending and advancing Western Canadian trade interests in Canada and abroad. Carlo leads on work on development of a national trade infrastructure plan and renewal of the nation's trade corridors. His research and advocacy are playing a critical role in achieving better trade agreements and drawing attention to the often neglected importance of the assets and systems critical to moving products from Alberta to our markets. He has a reputation for developing creative solutions to some of the major challenges facing Canadian exporters and defending Canadian interests in trade with China and the US, and is a frequent commentator on the news. I just saw him on CBC the other day with all of the things that have been going on. As the Director of Trade and Trade Infrastructure, Carlo has a long history in international public policy, including as a professional affiliate at the Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan, as non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and as a member of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. So with that, with those bona fides, you could see why I thought it would be a great idea if we could get him on here. And thank you so much for giving us your time today, sir.
Sir, I really am in trouble now. No, thanks for having me. I should note just at the outset, I'll be with Canada West for another 2 or 3 weeks. I'm moving to join the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary to do similar work, including hopefully more work on the North America file and more work on China, more focused work. I should also note that, yeah, you've seen me on CBC, but Sean Haney, I mean, what's up with your friend Sean? He hasn't had me on in like months. So we need everyone on the phone to pick up their phone and call Sean and give him a hard time.
So we can get on local news. Excellent. So Carlo, this is a bit of a conversation today. We've got some questions we can dive into, but I just wanted to start out by getting your take from the top. What is going on? Can you unpack this just at a high level for us?
Sure, I can do a brief overview. Let me note that no one really has an idea of what's going on in the situation with the US. I've got a better read on China. I was just there a few weeks ago. Some of you may have seen the article in the Globe and Mail about my conversations with senior government officials at the Ministry of Commerce about ag. But no, with the US, it's not as if we haven't spent the past 5 years doing a deep dive into an area that most of the analysts in Canada and most of the foreign policy community has not touched, which is really trying to understand the origins of the tariffs, which reside in the new right, capital N, capital R, new right in the US, what you think of as the America First movement. So we do have a fairly good idea at Canada West, and I think our Premier, Daniel Smith, also has insights that other premiers don't, and certainly federal officials don't, into the thinking of this group to be able to guide policy. But to stop the advertisement and the shout out to politicians, the issue is we're undergoing another in a series of structural changes in US institutions and the American body politic. The last time we saw something similar on the economic front were the Nixon shocks. 1971, we woke up on a Monday morning in August to discover that there was a 10% surcharge on all goods from Canada. Well, there were a couple exceptions, oil, autos, but all other goods, including agricultural goods, had a 10% surcharge. That was an era of great political tumult in the US. We're seeing something even greater than that this time around. The attack on institutions, norms, and ways of doing business in the US is unprecedented. Fundamental economic theory, the idea of alternative facts and different interpretations of the same event are gotten to a point that we just haven't seen before in the US. We've had attempts in the US in the past, the John Birch Society in the 1950s, and the attempts to take over the conservative movement that were thwarted by Bill Buckley and the Heritage Foundation. This time, the barbarians, quote unquote, have come over the ramparts, and we're seeing a wholesale change on the ground. So that's beyond what you're seeing. Our normal way of thinking about the US, reasoning about the US, has been upturned. So take tariffs. The thought on tariffs in Canada was, and this was shared by most politicians, including our premier, until I think she's changed her mind recently, but the Americans would never do this because there would be too much pain for the American people. If we just tell the Americans how much pain there will be, the tariffs won't happen. What we didn't realize is that the America First movement knew there would be pain with the tariffs. They talked about there being pain, and they were fully prepared to pay the price. Had we known that, we would not have used that as a reason not to prepare for the tariffs. So that's just one example. Ag communities in the US, we think that those who will be hurt by tariffs will be opposed to them politically. 444 counties that the USDA lists as agricultural in the US. In each one of those, the vote for Donald Trump increased in this election. He took all but 11 of those counties. Why is this important? Not because they may be potential allies, but because these were the groups that were most hurt by Trump's trade war with China and the retaliatory tariffs, $28 billion. So our understanding of the US is fundamentally out of date, decades, if not generations, out of date what's there now. So your question about how do we understand what's going on has to go back to being able to understand what's happening in the US and not using frameworks for thinking about the US from Bill Clinton or George Bush or even Barack Obama to try and understand the current situation. And last bit, Alberta, I think, is the one place that gets this, which is why you're hearing talk from provincial ministers like the Advanced Ed Minister Sawney about investing in deep capacity in Canada at the secondary level to understand these changes. You've got one professor down at Lethbridge who's really good on the US. You've got one at the U of A, and that's it in the province for understanding. So it's not just Trump, but the backlash to Trump. What comes after Trump? Our heads are going to be spinning for a generation or two in the US. If we don't build this capacity to understand what's going on, then immediate solutions, trying to solve the issues folks listening to face, will be built on a false understanding and false premises about the US and maybe do more harm than good. So I can't I can answer your question because I spent 5 years studying this, but until we expand that capacity to reach political leaders and folks like yourself, we're constantly going to be getting whiplash and taken by surprise.
I'm constantly struck with the tension between whether there really is that fundamental shift in thinking in the conservative movement in the United States on protectionism in particular, because we don't really see it here in the conservative movement in Canada. You know, the Conservative Party in Canada is still the party of free trade, is still the party of getting rid of interprovincial trade boundaries and et cetera. And then the other way to look at these things somewhat hopefully maybe is that maybe they're just being used as, for lack of a better word, blackmail or economic coercion. Um, can you talk more about, do you really think there is that fundamental shift in thinking about protectionism in the States happening, or is this economic coercion like Trump has said repeatedly?
Yes. So with the America First movement and with the new right in the US, there are factions. It is not a solid, unified movement. So take the tariff issue. You have the economic populists on the new right, American Compass, AFPI, and other think tanks that have a belief in tariffs as a means to bring jobs back to the US. It's an argument against the supremacy of economic efficiency. The goal of trade is not to improve GDP. The goal of trade is to improve the lives of ordinary working Americans. So this is the pushback against liberalism and the chief aim to use tariffs to force companies to move jobs to the US. If you're selling a product to Americans, that product should be made in the US so Americans have more jobs, good middle class working jobs. But then you have other groups like the oligarchs, the Elon Musk, the Zuckerbergs that have joined the movement at the last minute. And their goal is going after competition law in other countries to allow the concentration of power that is the business model that they have going in. Then you've got the China hawks running around in the background, and tariffs are a tool to force countries in line or to entice countries in line with US policy towards China. That's a deeper, more complicated argument, but just to get through the groups. So you have these different groups fighting within the America First movement. So yes, it is coercion, but yes, it is also moving jobs back to the US. Yes, it is about US technological dominance abroad. Yes, it is about fighting China, and there are probably a half dozen other things. So you can't pin it down to one item. There is a probability for each one influencing the decisions at any given time. But this is part of the complexity of what we face.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's very insightful. Okay, I got to ask about USMCA then, because we had a trade agreement. What is the status of USMCA at this point? Is it just absolutely out the window? Or are we going to have to sit down and renegotiate at this point? What are our options, given that we've had a trade agreement in place for the past, no, almost 8 years now?
Yeah, well, going back longer. With Nixon, we didn't have the agreement. There was a breaking of sort of WTO, GATT, Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Conventions. But certainly, this is one of the things that makes what Trump's doing unprecedented. And this is what I mean by the breakdown of institutions and norms. A trade agreement, honoring a trade agreement is an institution and a norm we've come to expect, yet we've had that dragged out from under us. So it calls into question the fundamental value of the CUSMA agreement with the US. Um, the main purpose of the agreement, the main benefit of the agreement was not lowering tariffs. Tariffs with the US are already low. The US average weighted mean tariff is like 1.49%. We got that down to zero. Ooh, that's a huge cut. But the purpose of the agreement was certainty, that we would have rules, that we could depend on access. And if there were problems, there was a means, dispute resolution, to settle the issues. And that worked fairly well. It continues to work fairly well. The GMO corn issue with Mexico is an example. But if we lose that certainty, then we lose the main purpose for the agreement. So here's the issue coming forward. The agreement is now up for review next summer, 2026. The Trump administration wants to start that review already. There are three outcomes to the review. One of the three parties decides it's no longer going to do this and just pull out. The agreement ends within 6 months. Two, got to watch which finger I pull in sequence here. Two, the Americans and we in Mexico decide we're going to continue the agreement. It'll go 6 years. We'll review it again. But the third option is the most dangerous. We conduct an annual review of the agreement. We agree that we won't kill the agreement, but we won't extend it indefinitely. Instead, we'll conduct annual reviews. So imagine being subject to 3 more years of Donald Trump dragging us to the table and holding the upcoming negotiation over our head like the sword of Damocles.
Yeah.
So that's a worst case outcome. So the question is, are we better off with CUSMA or should we just not go in for the humiliation of renegotiation and instead fall back to the World Trade Organization, most favored nations tariffs, which our analysis so far indicates not that big a loss. I mean, similar to the loss we suffered from going from NAFTA to CUSMA, and that was a loss.
Hmm.
So that's a question we're going to have to face up to as Canadians. And it's one we need to start thinking about now.
So before we go into specifics about Alberta's economy and, our industries, I just have to ask, if we're looking at the prospect of just being economically coerced every month or every year, is it in our interest to keep playing this game? Well, what should the people in Ottawa be doing about this?
So there's not much we can do. I mean, across the country, it's like 78.1, 78.3% of our exports as a country go to the US. We rely on that trade for 2/3 of our GDP. Two out of every $3 we earn. In Alberta, it's of course 88 point, I don't know exactly, but 88 some percent of our GDP, depending on the price of oil, comes from trade with the US. We simply can't move to other markets. Look, 1971 Nixon, that's
Mm,
when we discovered diversification. We've been at it for 50 years, and look where we are.
mm,
So your question, do we really have any choice? Um,
mm,
and I would get back to my first point. We've got to get better at playing this game. If we're going to be stuck playing this game, then we've got to get better at it. And that means being better informed, not being taken by surprise, investing the resources that we haven't had to invest um, to be able to play the game. And this is a point for your listeners. We've had, since the Nixon shocks, 50 years of relatively easy, cheap access to the US.
mhm.
That's not coming back. We're going to have to step up our game, which means spending more resources, more time, and more money managing the relationship with the US. We've tried going elsewhere. The trade numbers haven't moved in 50 years. We're not going to rush into Honduras for 3 times the work and half the money and 4 times the risk. So we're going to have to get better at this. And that's going to mean more money spent on the relationship with the US, which I know is going to be hard news for folks in southern Alberta who have enjoyed not paying really for their access with the US. And I welcome pushback on that comment. I'm being provocative to make a point.
No, I honestly, maybe somebody on the call could disagree with it, but I think you're probably right. I mean, I remember my jaw hitting the table when I saw that our own government was spending $50,000 a month on lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C., but now it seems very, very smart.
Seems like they should have spent a bit more, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. And that was just started up, I think, before Christmas, and it was like, yep, that was the right thing to do. Good move. Okay, so I'm curious then about our industries, and I know you've written extensively on this very, very recently, particularly egg. Please tell us how this is going to impact us and what our probable situations are. You have a lot of folks here from rural Alberta, from strongly agricultural producing areas. Talk to us.
Yeah, so you know how much time I spend down in southern Alberta and how much that I love the area. Um, Still have that Lethbridge tip jar around here where I have to, the staff here makes me put in a toonie every time I mention Lethbridge in the staff meeting. Um, but how is it going to impact you? Well, look, of all the industries in Canada, you are arguably among the most diversified. So you look at our exports to, say, China. Nationally, it's like 3% or something, but for ag, it's 13, 17% on the year. With canola and other crops, we have managed to get out of the US market. So if diversification, continued diversification has hopes for any sector in Canada, it's going to be ag. But that takes you into a whole nother set of problems. The global trade order, the rules-based order, is not just broken down in the US, it's breaking down globally. So we're going to need the ability to protect Canadian farmers outside of the US. With the US, you know, the tariff war and the problems with the US creates more of an incentive to look elsewhere. Um, some industries that are deeply integrated, like beef, that's not going to be easy. But for others, for canola and others, it certainly is. So I'm extremely suspect about the diversification argument in Canada. I've just written about that. It came out today if anyone wants to read it. But you guys do have some hope in that area. Um, but again, preparing for disruptions. We need new thinking. I don't have an answer for you um, in terms of what can be done about this. How it impacts you, well, that information's out there. Al Musil just put out a piece on this. I think everyone knows Al. Um, I would urge you to look at that piece. He put it out with Tyler McCain at CAPI. So I think your folks down there are familiar with these guys, and that information is clearly available from them. But it's not the immediate impact you have to think about. It's the fact that this is a structural change. This is not going to disappear tomorrow. This is not going to disappear with an election and change in administration with the US. This is going to, in all likelihood, be a long-term struggle. So while you think about dealing with today's issues, you've also got to think or have people thinking about the longer term response.
So there's a lot of community leaders on the call here too. Our friend Trevor Lewington, he's also the mayor of Sterling that you're aware of. I know him and his village administration have sat down and prepared budget scenarios for various levels of recession. Should people be thinking about their municipal budgets and a potential recession, or is it not that big of a five-alarm fire?
So this is going to be one of those yes but answers.
Sure.
So again, we're looking at probabilistic forecast here.
Yeah.
Quick example, when Trump took the Republican nomination in March, the probability of tariffs went to 50-50. If he won the election, they'd be likely. When he won the general election in November, then that probability went up to like near certain. So we should have been preparing back in March, but we shouldn't have been preparing to the same degree that we should have been preparing in November, which means, okay, it's 50-50, we've got some time out. Let's do quiet background surveys of business. Let's do some gaming out. But when March hits, or when November hits, it's holy shit moment. Let's take that gentle work we did and ramp it up and build on it. So I would argue it's the same thing now. And what Trevor's doing is absolutely spot on. You need to quietly, calmly, not in a state of panic, but now calmly sort of plan out scenarios, gather data, spend your spare time thinking about this so that if it does move into crisis, you're not scrambling to do everything. You've at least spent a smaller proportional amount of time and money preparing to be able to respond to the crisis. So that's how I would think about it. But we didn't do any of that, which is why we're panicking right now, which is why we're on the back foot right now.
Okay. Um, I'm a perpetual optimist. Um, when I see change, I try to look for the opportunity. And in my mind, I'm still optimistically hopeful that if we're seeing a strong protectionist trend happening in the United States, we are still continental resources. And there's a lot of resources that we have, a lot of products that we produce that the United States will still want to get access to, particularly if the world's oceans, shall we say, get a little bit more unsafe. Are there opportunities that our industries here in Alberta can really take advantage of and might be looking to lean into in the future, particularly if the US takes a harder stance on some other foreign importers like China, India, that kind of thing?
Yeah, there certainly are opportunities. Every crisis has opportunities. Whether or not you want them at the expense of the crisis is another question. But certainly there are opportunities. The added focus on diversification will not help everyone, but it will help some folks in the agricultural community. So that's one sign for optimism. The second is we've seen a renewed push within Canada for liberalizing internal trade. We've seen a renewed push for things. Quebec saying, well, hold on to that pipeline thing. Where is that pipeline? Someone show where did that pipeline thing go? So you've seen opportunities. It's what Milton Friedman described as the nature of a crisis and the work that folks like us do. The policy that gets implemented during a crisis is the policy that's lying around. What had been politically impossible becomes economically and politically necessary. So for issues that have played agriculture, less internal trade, but trade infrastructure,
Mhm.
Do we finally have the moment to get serious about improving the competitiveness, the reliability, the efficiency of our trade infrastructure? The work's been done. We've done it in partnership with the Business Council of Canada, the Canadian
Hmm.
Chamber. All the work's been done, but it's been politically impossible. Do we now have a moment where the politically impossible becomes the politically necessary and we can move these things?
Carlo, can you talk about the specific examples you're mentioning, just for those who might not have read some of these papers?
Sure. So with the trade infrastructure work, there's a paper out called From Shovel Ready to Shovel Worthy. It's improving our trade infrastructure by adopting approach that most of our competitors use. Long-term pipelines of projects based on improvements to the national integrated supply and production chains. So rather than our current shovel ready approach, where we listen to the loudest voice yelling about a problem and we rush out to fix it for political as well as maybe emergency needs. We instead have done an analysis of what's needed to improve the entire system. So if you increase, say, grain shipments and you force railroads to move grain, what does that do to our friends at the Alberta Forestry Products? Or what does that do to oil? Or what does that do to manufacturers in the province? So we've had this approach in the past, but if we were able to take long range project plans, have the data to be able to inform those decisions and the intelligence to turn that data into sound decision making, you would see vast improvements in reliability, efficiency, and return on investment. So that's just been difficult to do at the federal level. The prairie provinces have started doing this based on some of the work that we've done, and the prairie provinces have an advantage, but that doesn't include BC
Hmm.
and outlets to the east. So that's the type of thing that's been lying around that just hasn't had the political will. But believe me, folks suddenly now, more so than with COVID, folks understand the importance of getting this done. So for farmers that have been suffering from transportation issues, yes, this is the long-term, large-scale solution. You can stop whacking the mole of whatever problem just propped it up and take control of the entire system. And that would bring huge, huge benefits to individual farmers, but also our diversification efforts.
Do you think we've got the political flexibility and ability to get things done like that in Canada, even in this current crisis, or will it take them, 4 years to ramp up a project, but then the crisis passes and we
I
don't
don't
get
know.
Energy East or a twinned rail line or
I don't know. But if it does happen, that I'm not going to get gloomy, but if we can't do it now, then that says something. But one issue we've had with the trade infrastructure file, I mentioned the Business Council of Canada, Canadian manufacturers and exporters, the Canadian Chamber, um, transportation groups, road builders associations. The one voice that hasn't been there has been ag. I've tried idiosyncratically whenever I'm at crop convention next week, I'll mention this to them. But I've tried idiosyncratically, talk to Sean Haney, did a whole webinar online
Mhm.
about this. But we just haven't seen champions emerge within the agricultural community to take this and put it forward. And I think if this doesn't happen, if the moment's not seized, when I look back, however many years from now, from my rocking chair on a porch someplace, yelling at the kids playing on my front lawn, um, I'm going to think about ag, and I'm going to think about the absence of the organized ag community in this. I just don't see the associations there at the table with us on this. I don't see the lobbying groups from ag in Ottawa there with us on this issue. So when I look back, I'm going to think about those voices that were silent.
I remember back when I worked at the Chamber of Commerce, there was a big push from Alberta and Saskatchewan to try to get a policy advisor in Ottawa with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. But the problem was is that their membership just didn't justify it because they often got large sponsorships from big companies in order to pay for those positions. And there just wasn't any inclusion at the community chamber level because most of the chambers are urban.
Yep. But with ag, you've got the money, the groups are financed. So you've got situations, and some of them are the largest companies are leaving, but that's inside baseball. I'll leave that to you guys. We don't need to hash that out here. But yeah, we just haven't had the situation where we've had to pay the real cost for what we have. And I
Mhm.
think the current crisis with the US is bringing it home finally that the easy complacent past we had. I know people are going to yell about specific problems, environmental issues, the US on beef and other issues, but come on, globally, look around the planet. We've had it fairly easy compared to, say, the guys down in Argentina, um, or even the Aussies. Um, but yeah, that era's ended.
Mm.
And the question is, how do we respond? How does the agricultural community respond to this change?
Speaking of having it easy, geopolitics. I was wondering if you could share your insights onto what our path forward is. It's, from where I sit, it looks pretty dicey. We're entering into a classic period of a Thucydides trap, rising power, but our global hegemon is contracting and turning inward. Um, what are we facing in ahead? What do you see and what do you think?
Oh boy, cities trap. Wow, man, Pete, you've upped your game. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Now, all kidding aside, I'll take one particular aspect I think is going to hit um, your community hardest, and that is the US-China trade war and the larger fight that the Americans are waging to counter what they see as an existential threat in China. I imagine that many of your listeners share that existential threat view. But again, look at the export numbers. You face two issues with China. One is the impact of China as a market, selling to China. Again, 13% of ag trade, 15%, whatever, versus 3% for general trade. So you're already heavily invested. Remember what happened with the NAFTA to CUSMA renegotiation. The Americans explicitly told us not to engage China in that agreement. They inserted a clause at the last minute that said, should any of the parties to the NAFTA agreement, US, Mexico, or Canada, enter into negotiations with China, the others could ask for a review, ask to see the agreement, and state that as a reason to withdraw. It doesn't prevent us from dealing with China, it scares us. So we took that to advice. We cut ties with China. And what happened? Not 5 minutes after the ink was dry on our agreement, the CUSMA agreement, the Americans turned around and signed their own trade agreement with China, the Phase One deal. That deal set up structural rules of trade, not the purchase agreements, but the change to rules that favored US producers or exporters at our expense. So this is the issue we face with China. One issue we face with China. The Americans will tell us not to engage China. It'll harm our relationship with China. And then the Americans, being the world's dominant power, will turn around and take advantage. The other issue we face is the rise of China as a global power, um, not in the existential threat, but in the inadvertent hits we take from China as the largest producer and exporter of a lot of what we produce. So take the recent opening of the port in Peru, the port of Shanghai, which is not specifically a Belt and Road initiative, but for all intents and purposes, a Belt and Road initiative investment. That port will increase Brazil's GDP by 1%. What is that growth going to come from? From cutting the shipping time from Brazil to Asia by 20 some days.
Yeah.
You suddenly have coming online massive potential production to displace us in Asia. So these are the geopolitical threats we face. One, the Americans and China and us getting caught in the middle, as happened with their Phase One agreement, where they threw us under the combine. The other are the inadvertent impacts of China as a global power, not directed at us necessarily, but their shift of global trade patterns to benefit China. Um, so those are the issues that we face, and I really worry about us not being prepared for the coming online of the port of Shanghai and in Peru and what that means for us. There are more such investments in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia, elsewhere in Southeast Asia that will also change trade patterns that will impact us.
I can't ask about geopolitics without following up by asking about demographics, because so many of these issues are intertwined with each other. Given that we're stuck basically trying to keep improving our population, increasing our population through immigration and dealing with the fallout from the tensions that that produces. And the United States is a little bit better off on the demographic profile than we are, but they're not too far behind. And places like China, you've got forecasters basically saying, there's going to be a contraction in population over straight over to people who are basically calling for the dissolution of the society from demographic collapse. How is that going to play into the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing and the fallout when it comes to trade, particularly with food?
Oh, I'm going to avoid most of that. Um, it's nice when the speaker just admits up front and doesn't pretend to dodge it. But on the issue, yes, we've had a model of immigration built on building an economy in another country in Canada, and that's had advantages over the U.S. The U.S. has a lottery system. We we bring people in based on points, but it creates tension within the receiving country when you're not creating a sense of nation, but you're creating an economy. And that leads to backlash eventually. I think you see this to some degree in Europe. Um, that's going to be an issue, I think, that haunts us going forward. But in terms of globally, a more interesting shift with demographics has been recent evidence that the rise of the global middle class, something on which I've worked for decades. We did a major conference in Saskatoon with Jerry Ritz on this to kind
Mhm.
of launch the importance of the rise of people with more money globally. And there's recent research to suggest that that really hasn't shifted patterns for food the way it shifted consumption patterns for luxury goods.
Interesting.
So people are still buying based on price and not as much on quality as we thought. If this preliminary evidence holds, and I must caution that this is really preliminary. I don't know that it's valid, but at least it's raised a question. It underlies our strategy about growing agriculture. Can we afford to sell based on quality and safety, if that's indeed the case? But this is the type of thinking and research that needs to be funded so that we can get ahead of these curves, that we could have seen the port of Shanghai coming and started reacting to that in advance. Oh, I should also note, side note here, the other thread about the port is that it's built from the ground up with automation, state of the art automation.
Mm.
From its inception to its building to its planning for the future, automation has been a central part. So it's not just another port in Peru that's going to cut transit time for Argentina and Brazil. It's going to do it with greater efficiency than we
Mhm.
can. You cannot increase automation at Vancouver without fighting with the unions. And I think everyone on this webinar has some experience or seen an article about the difficulties in getting automation in our ports. So that's going to be a double whammy for us.
So I think it's probably plain to anybody listening in that I could nerd out with Carlo for a very long time. But I want to take a step back and allow anybody to ask any questions they might, specific to your industry or something that's come up to the top of your brain as you've been sitting and listening. Please feel free to turn on your camera and join in the conversation.
Hey,
If you,
when does my two guys pizza arrive? You promised me lunch.
I can get on the phone after this and get it dropped off to you. Just send me an address. Yeah,
All the way from Lethbridge, yeah.
all the way from Lethbridge. Huh. There's a fun story on the side about international trade and supply chains about dairy products in the United States and the massive cheese vaults that they have. But we can have that another day. John, I see you put your camera on. You're still muted though.
Yes, I have. I'm not now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now, Peter?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, with that, I'd like to ask Carlo this question. When Trump was talking about his tariffs on United States, I mean on Canada and Mexico, he made mention while talking about that of the EU and how he being traded
You're breaking up, John.
by them as well. So would there be an up? Can you hear me better now?
A little bit better now. We got as far
So
as Trump talking about the EU.
yeah, so he said that they're being treated poorly by the EU as well. So would there be an opportunity for us to carve out, I guess, deals with the EU? Um, or is this just a way of getting to the EU through us?
Right. So I've said frequently that Trump is negotiating through us as much as with us. The Americans are attempting to do what they did in 1971, 1930, rewrite the global rules of trade. This time they're going at it by picking countries off in twos or threes. So certainly the US has issues globally, which means not just with us. So yeah, there certainly is that element of making an example. If you take the two countries with whom you'd be most hurt if you impose tariffs. So, Canada would never impose tariffs on Mexico and Canada. They're too important. The US would suffer too much damage. If you start with them, then you clearly send a signal to the other monkeys who are watching you kill the chicken in your backyard. That's Chinese proverb. But anyway, but that's certainly part of it. But the EU, we can't get the EU to finalize our trade agreement that we have with them. The crisis hasn't gotten to the point yet where old issues are being cast aside in light of the threat with Donald Trump. But interesting, what happened last time was that we had the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. You may remember that. The Obama administration supported it. It was a means to contain China, to put pressure on China, to protect ourselves in Asia from China. But when Donald Trump came in, everyone was about to walk away from the agreement, except that the Japanese said, well, hold on a second. We thought this agreement would help protect us from China, but now we need the agreement to protect us from Donald Trump. So we do have the ability to, in the margins, mitigate, okay, not eliminate, but mitigate some of the damages by looking to things like the TPP as alternatives to the other rules-based trade elements that are breaking down. So certainly, should the Europeans have a come to Jesus moment about Donald Trump and the danger it faces, and by come to Jesus, I mean the Italians get over durum wheat, the Danes get over what's the chickens or beef or whatever. If we have that sort of switch, that certainly would be an opportunity to mitigate. The downside is nothing's going to piss Trump off more than us doing that. So we've got to weigh this carefully. But that's the existential threat we face. We're so integrated with the US, taking actions to defend ourselves may make things worse.
Thank you. Questions for anybody else for Carlo? I'm looking for hands up, but if I don't see it, just pop your camera on and go ahead and ask away.
Are these all Kansas City Chiefs fans out there?
I do have to ask if nobody's putting up their hand here. So unified trade action from other members of the Western quote unquote alliance. What are the barriers to us engaging in a unified response to a friend who's gone rogue on us, with people like some of the Southeast Asian countries that we're good friends with, or the Europeans?
So
And Darcy has a question as well.
is that Darcy McGee
I'm not too sure.
or Darcy Fitzgerald? Anyway, um, the uh, the opportunity is there, but again, you have to think about the backlash from Trump. When the BRIC countries mentioned creating a different reserve currency, Trump immediately threatened them with 100% tariff. Um, so you're going to have that sort of reaction. The Americans feel that they've been wronged globally. They feel that they've borne a burden for the rest of the world, been taken advantage of for decades, so they feel completely justified in trying to correct a wrong. Should we, in their view, try to perpetuate or continue the wrong, they're going to react. So what from our view looks like simple self-defense, the Americans will view very differently.
As aggression. Okay. Darcy Turner.
Oh, different Darcy.
Yeah. Darcy is unmuted, but I can't hear anything. You have the mic, Darcy, if you're still there. Yeah. Any other questions from the group today? Darcy's having a bank system problem. Yeah.
Tell them to put the question in the chat.
Yeah, you can always type it in
Yeah,
there too.
he's there, Peter. His question is there.
I'm just trying to find his question. Bob, I can't see his question. All I see is bank system problem.
Yeah, sorry, I just saw his name pop up. You mentioned getting ag involved. He has bank system problem. You mentioned getting ag involved. So
Bank system problem. So
maybe is that asking how to get the agriculture industry involved?
um, ah,
There it is.
so yeah. So that's a question I have. I would turn around and pose that question to the group. I've been trying to get ag groups involved in issues like trade infrastructure. It's been easier with the business associations. They've just been more receptive. They've contributed to the work. I don't understand why we haven't gotten, and again, I've been with Sean Haney. Sean did a webinar on this. Sean gets this. I know that you get this, Pete. Trevor gets this. But we just haven't had any success. Part of the issue is I don't have the money and resources to conduct a proper PR campaign, a proper outreach campaign, organized, targeted, etc. Sorry, we just don't have the money. We just don't have the resources. We don't have the resources to do what we've done. You know, God help us trying to do more. So I don't know. I don't know why ag isn't at the table with this issue. I've given a few dozen talks to various conventions and events like this. Again, the webinar with Sean Haney, and I just don't understand why we haven't gotten receptivity to the message. We had the same issue with interoperability and tractor hacking and right to repair. So maybe this is, yeah, something I just don't understand.
Bob.
Yeah, and Carlo, thanks for bringing that up. And I live in and work like Peter in Northeast Alberta, and I don't know how to say this, and I mean the utmost respect to everybody here and abroad. We seem to consider ourselves in a bubble. We're not connected to the global aspects and how we rely on that. And again, what you said earlier was very critical. Education, consistent education and understanding supply chains, how the global economy works, and whether you're in Bow Island or a little village up here called Blendon, it's not local anymore. It's global. And you're exactly right. We have a very great focus on dealing with our issues in ag, making sure the soil's properly, maintained. We excel at that. But when it comes to economic development in ag, with ag societies, counties, you know, again, we ship raw commodities away, but we don't manufacture it. We don't have those value-added products. I know I'm throwing a lot in here, but there's still a disconnect that I feel, you know, that more emphasis has to be put on educating, you know, people and how the systems work and their role in what you talked about. I don't know if I made any sense there, but I've been struggling with this for about 10 years, that there's not enough emphasis on this issue, that agriculture has to be at that table for whatever reason. I don't know.
Yeah, you remind me of a couple points. So I have, reached out to, or not reached out to local groups. Look, I can't get to every group. I don't know, probably 98% of the groups. But when I do get calls, I do try and go out and talk. So I spend a day driving up to High Prairie um, to give a talk. And these are important for me because they give me insights. I get to talk to people in the community and understand. But I can't do that one by one,
Yeah.
community by community across Alberta. It's simply just not practical. But I also recall Martin Irbel had me down to talk to the Lethbridge County councilors or commissioners. They were preparing to go to China. And afterward, we went out to lunch. And my wife came down because she worked at the University of Calgary and she was doing international trips and she was explaining to them some of the logistic issues. But we're out to lunch. And I remember one of the counselors saying, you know, we get your point and um, we understand that we're doing this. We've had 6 visits from China or Japan and we haven't gone back. So we've got to go over. They're our largest purchaser. We've got to maintain the relationship. They want to see us. He said, but I really wish you could come to me when I go to the Save on Foods on Saturday, because I'm going to get yelled at by the other farmers and people in the community for going on this junket to China and wasting this money. I said, you can't be serious. Folks have to know that this is where the money's coming from. He's like, no. So I wrote a piece for the Lethbridge Herald, making the case that, look, the county folks are gone. Anyone here that gives them a hard time needs to, check out and move someplace else. I had to do the same thing in Saskatchewan when Scott Moe went to the UAE for the global, it was canola or oilseeds convention. And he was getting flack back home for going to Dubai to play golf. So I don't know. I found that time and time again in my work, um, that response. And that's why I kept going on about having to pay more money for access in the US. Uh, this has got to sink in on us that we've been able to get away for this for so long. I just don't see that being able to continue. I could be wrong, but I've been wrong about other things. But I don't think I'm wrong about this. I'm almost certain I'm not going to be wrong about this.
Well, I share your frustration and anxiety because I've experienced it, firsthand. And I grew up on a farm. We were, the generations before me were very traditional. I'm of European, descent, Ukrainian. What I learned from my grandfather and my dad, and the farming today, and how I don't know if it's complacency. I really don't know. I've been trying to put my finger on this for the longest time. For the longest time.
You do have advocates in the community, folks, I think, who really get this. I think of my friends, the amateurs, just up the road here in Innisfail, and people like that who are strong advocates in the community. Maybe at the end of the day, that's what happens.
Yeah.
We need those voices in the communities to start speaking up. We've got information that's written less pinheady, or pinheads not that sharp at Canada West. So we've got information that is a bit more accessible that can be used. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, maybe that's it. This has got to be grassroots. This can't come from the elites telling you. This has got to come from you telling the elites, including the elites within the agricultural community, your associations, the people that run the organizations. It's got to come from the grassroots, I think.
I agree with that. Thanks, Carlos.
It strikes me that we've got a very strong network of local associations. Like even down here, we've got something like 13 growers associations that have their headquarters in Southern Alberta. And they're very active groups that work with their members. Their members are in the, ones and tens to dozens. And there's a lot of these in Alberta. But we don't have that filtering up to the federal level from all provinces where all of these small groups are contributing to have a voice in Ottawa to inform policy on the agricultural file there. At least if it exists, I don't know about it either. Is there a way that we could get all of these local groups to band together in that way to fund a presence in Ottawa, similar to what the chambers do?
Yeah, I worry about voices in Ottawa getting captured by Ottawa. And I think to some degree the associations have. If you're going to survive in Ottawa, you've got to play the game. Again, I spent my first 10 years in Canada in Ottawa. Coming from Washington, D.C. to Ottawa, that was, yeah. And over a decade out here, getting that out of my system. But I think you got to do, the work is hard. This is hard. It's not easy. And I think having a presence in Ottawa is good if you can assure that it remains connected back to your local groups. That's what I think is missing to some degree.
Mm-hmm. We're coming right up on our time, folks. If anybody has a last minute question they want to get in, please, John, you're waving at the camera.
Yes, I think talking about primary agricultural producers, for generations now, we've had this unrealistic belief that we have products that we produce here that are superior to everyone else's in the world. And so we don't need to do any marketing and build any relationships. And I think that's a bigger problem than we realize.
Yeah.
Well, we're starting to see that show up, but just out there again, another random side note, but one of our greatest advantages in Canada, yes, quality, yes, safety, but we have never imposed an embargo on food. Look at the Americans, 1950s, China, the Great Leap Forward. China's got millions of people dying from their greatest famine. What do the Americans do? Impose an embargo on grains to China. They demand that we join them. Diefenbaker tells the Americans to go get bleeped, and we continue sales to China. We did it despite having just engaged them in the Korean War, but we also did it because we're not the Americans. We suffered great damage from the Americans threatening us. But Argentina, it's like every other year they're imposing embargoes for some reason. The Russians, you go around globally, and it's pretty much us and the Aussies that have never used food as a weapon. I think in terms of changing our approach to people, that's it. You can get cheaper goods someplace, but why do the Japanese stick with us despite our difficulties? They know we are eventually going to deliver. We're not going to cut them off the way the Brazilians or potentially the Argentines will. So anyway, if you want to end on a positive note, that's something we have, and it's something to think about in the coming global contest between the U.S. and China and the American demands that we adhere to them. It was Diefenbaker from Prince Albert, his ag minister from, I forget where in Saskatchewan he was, but it was folks on the prairies that stood up to the Americans for Canadian interest. And I think if we can get back to that spirit of Diefenbaker, that could, I don't know, give us hope or guidance, but it certainly shows that we were able to do it in a different time. Again, it was easier to do it. We weren't as dependent on the US, but we still did it. There was a little bit of prairie backbone in Ottawa in our not too distant past.
That's an excellent place to leave it off on. Thank you very much, Carlo. If folks liked listening to Carlo today and found it interesting, he's also going to be at the Southern Alberta Economic Summit that's hosted by SouthGrow and our friends across Southern Alberta. That's coming up on March the 27th here in the city of Lethbridge at the Agri-Food Center. Make sure you grab your tickets for that. because Carlo will be there taking questions and talking about international trade as well. And thanks so much
And
for coming out
and getting
for
lunch, right?
and getting lunch. That's
And
right.
actually
There'll be
getting fed.
plenty of good food there. And you'll be in your new role with the UFC at that time too.
Yeah, it's kind of a farewell tour to Southern Alberta. I'm not going to be coming down as much. But yeah, come down one last trip, see you, Trevor, Martin, and the gang. It'll be good.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, folks. That's the end of our official time today. Have a great day out there and stay warm. Carlo, we'll see you in a few weeks when you come down. And good luck as you venture out into your new role.
Thanks.
Thanks, folks. Have a great day.